me ask y'all something. Were black people in America before Columbus?
Or is that something that you just want to be true?
Now, this idea keeps coming up in the comments under our video, where Africans crossed the ocean and Olmec heads prove it, and black people were everywhere before Europe even woke up.
Right.
And, you know, we're not mocking it, and we're not just repeating it either. Because this video isn't here to ridicule the idea.
Or to sell it to you.
It's about slowing down, doing the research, and separating what we want to be true from what history can actually support.
Exactly.
Because sometimes the most interesting part of a theory isn't whether it's right or wrong, but why so many people are drawn to it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And look, some of it sounds possible.
It sure does. Yeah.
Some of it even feels right.
Mm-hmm.
But feeling right and being true aren't the same thing.
Right.
So we're going to talk about it.
All right. Well, let's talk about it. So let me start with how this video kind of actually came to be. So on one of our past videos, as Haas already mentioned, you know, the comment section turned into this whole debate that we didn't even really expect. You know, what began as a conversation about Native American identity, you know, quickly shifted into something much bigger.
Right.
And, you know, we had people, you know, we had some Native folks, black folks, and, you know, some folks who identified as both, really.
Right.
Coming out of the woodwork, all arguing different sides of the same question, right?
Now, our original point, it was pretty straightforward, right?
Right.
We were talking about how the one drop rule blurred, collapsed, and in many cases erased people's ability to legally and socially identify as Native.
Mm-hmm.
How blackness, once assigned,
it swallowed everything else, you know?
It swallowed everything up.
You're going to be black.
Yeah.
But
then another argument kept popping up in the comments.
Mm-hmm.
Over and over again.
Right.
What if black folks weren't just mixed into Native identity, they said? What if black folks were the original Native Americans?
Were black people already in America when the slave trade started? Absolutely.
I'm not African American because that started with Jesse in 87.
I'm one of the black Americans who believe that we are indigenous to America.
Ain't no way the transatlantic slave trade happened the way they claimed it happened.
We realized that people came from Africa and were already doing a trade and barter with the Mayans long before anybody ever came to the Americas.
Science also agrees that there were two populations here pre-Columbian. And no black Americans aren't Afro-Indigenous, they're just regular indigenous Americans.
Dr. King say the Negro people find themselves in exile in their own land. He did not say they brought them from Africa and put them here. He said the Negro people in their own land.
Now, I'll be honest, we hadn't seen any historical evidence supporting that claim. But instead of dismissing it, we started asking a different question. Why is this theory so widespread? Where did it come from? And what emotional or political need is it satisfying? There's a story that a lot of us have heard. In fact, multiple stories, right?
Right.
You know, that we were conquerors, warriors, explorers.
Right.
You know, we were the Moors, we were the Hebrews.
Right.
And, you know, our roots in America go deeper and beyond colonization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be honest, that story feels really, really powerful.
Feels great.
Right. And it heals something. It heals something about our identity, right?
Right.
But the uncomfortable question is it really true?
Is it true?
Right. And if it isn't, what are we trading away by believing it? Because when mythology replaces history, it doesn't just distort the past. It reshapes how we understand ourselves, right?
Yeah, in the present.
Mm-hmm.
So, for many people of African descent, our history begins with captivity, erasure, and displacement. Mm-hmm. Exploring the possibility of pre-enslavement presence in the Americas can feel empowering.
Right.
Because it reframes Black identity as ancient, autonomous, and rooted rather than solely defined by bondage.
Right.
This emotional and cultural motivation does not automatically make the theory false, but it does shape how it is received and shared.
And now, you know, when you look around, this question is everywhere. It's in viral threads, TikToks, YouTube essays, case in point, right?
Case in point.
Right. And a lot of it centers around, you know, African kings in America, the Moors, the Olmecs, and of course, the big one, the hidden history that the schools hid from you, right?
Right.
And as I stated before, you know, this can feel good. It can feel liberating. But some of it does give me pause. And, you know, because...
Rightfully so.
But at the end of the day, I do believe that all of it deserves to be taken seriously and carefully examined.
Absolutely. Extraordinary claims demand more than repetition and belief.
Right.
They demand physical evidence, consistent accounts, and independent confirmation.
Right.
Right? We have to look closely at the gaps that get ignored in the historical context that makes this theory resonate so strongly right now. Because at its core, this isn't just a debate about the past. It's a struggle over identity in the present.
It also helps to recognize that Black origin myths do not emerge in isolation. Every civilization constructs comforting stories about where it came from. We got Rome had Romulus and Remus. You know, Great Britain claimed descent from the Trojan founders, right? And the great mighty United States of America says that it built itself on manifest destiny. And that is the myth that this was an empty country. Continent, that is, I'm sorry.
Right.
You know, and the difference is not that some cultures use myths and others do not. The difference is whose myths get institutionalized as official history, and whose are labeled as mere speculation. Western nations have long blurred myth and record when it served power, right?
To understand why the pre-Columbian theory exists, we will examine West African maritime capacity, oral traditions like those surrounding Abu Bakr II, ambiguous early European records, visual arguments such as the Olmec heads, and modern genetic data.
Now, the first obstacle is not even really evidence. It's actually assumption. The assumption is that in the pre-Columbian era, West Africa lacked the technological, organizational, and intellectual capacity for long-distance maritime travel. That assumption, however, collapses the moment we take a serious look at West African civilization.
Empires like Mali and Songhai were not marginal societies operating at the edge of the known world. They were complex state systems with bureaucracies and taxation, professional armies, urban centers, and vast trade networks spanning thousands of miles.
And you don't administer territory at that scale without advanced logistics, right?
You can't move gold,
people,
salt,
animals,
and information across deserts and rivers without having some form of sophisticated planning and engineering knowledge. It's just not gonna happen.
And so the reign of Mansa Musa makes this very clear. You know, his famous pilgrimage to Mecca is often reduced to spectacle or myth, but beneath that spectacle was infrastructure. Musa's journey required provisioning, caravans, coordinating routes, managing security, and maintaining diplomatic relationships across regions that he did not control. That level of coordination implies not only just wealth, but systems of complex thinking. It implies navigational knowledge, supply chain management, and an understanding of distance and risk. And these are not traits of a civilization boxed in by geography.
Not at all. And then there is Abu Bakr II. And according to multiple West African oral traditions, which were later recorded by Arab historians, Abu Bakr II abdicated the throne to launch an expedition westward into the Atlantic, Not a symbolic voyage, not a single ship, but fleets. First he sent like 200 ships or boats, and I believe one returned. And then after that he sent like 2,000 ships of which he actually went along on the second voyage, maiden voyage. And he was equipped with provisions and crews, and they were deliberately sent to find what lie beyond the horizons.
Right. But critics often dismiss this account because it survives primarily through oral history.
Right.
But that dismissal reveals a deeper bias. The idea that written European and Arabic records are inherently more credible than African knowledge systems. Oral traditions in West Africa was not casual storytelling. It was archival. You had the griots, who were trained custodians of political, genealogical, and historical memory. Their role was precisely to preserve the state knowledge across generations.
Traditionally in Africa, to work as griot or to even become as a griot means you have to be born into the family of griot. The work of griot is recounting the tribal history of our people. The griot deals with the reality, things that happened within the society in the past. Storyteller deals with the mythology.
Is there still any differences between female and male griots?
Female griots have a role to play by singing and dancing along the music. So the singing that the female griots do, this is the epic narrative. They recite history of clans or tribes.
I mean, it had to be a strong skill that was a coveted position to be responsible for holding the genealogical, the historical, just all of the details of civilization. In order to be in that position, there had to have been training for years.
And
a certain understanding of philosophy, just the way that the mind worked in order to retain that type of information. It had to be, just incredible.
Yeah, that's a big brain.
That's a big brain.
That's not just a regular.
That's not a primitive person.
Right, like us. Exactly. That's definitely not a primitive person.
No, and more importantly, the question is not whether Abu Bakr II succeeded. The question is whether the attempt itself was plausible.
Right.
West Africa has a long history of riverine navigation along the Niger, Senegal, and Gambia rivers. It had many coastal fishing and trade cultures, which provided access to timber, sail materials, and skilled labor. And once we consider this, the idea that maritime experimentation occurred is not extraordinary at all.
Right.
Actually,
it's very likely.
It's very likely.
Right. Yeah. But what is extraordinary is how quickly modern narratives foreclose this possibility, right?
Yeah.
The resistance to this idea is less about ships and more about hierarchy. Accepting that the West African civilizations could conceive of, fund, and attempt Atlantic voyages disrupts a deeper story.
Right.
That exploration, curiosity, and world making are uniquely European traits, right?
Yeah.
But when we look closely, we find that this is not about just the absence of this existence, but it's about the active erasure of it.
Yeah.
This
section of history doesn't ask us to replace one myth with another. It asks us to reconsider what we've been taught to find reasonable. When you strip away the assumptions of primitiveness, the question shifts from could they to something far more uncomfortable.
Right.
Why are we so invested in believing they couldn't?
Right. And another line to consider, another line of argument that is, emerges not from definitive proof, but from historical friction points. Those moments where early European records briefly disrupt clean timelines. In the journals of Christopher Columbus, that guy,
right,
there are passages describing conversations where indigenous peoples spoke of traders with darker skin tones,
right,
arriving from either the south or the east, and they were carrying these distinctive weapons that were often, at least translated, as dark spears or metal-tipped arms that was unfamiliar to the Caribbean.
Right.
And in fact, on an episode of Odd Salon episode that is in, and they're right here on YouTube.
Right here on this platform.
Dan Von Foyle mentions this. And here he is now. Let's take a look.
Evidence has surfaced and continually grown to indicate that many of these pre-Columbian explorers might have come from Africa. So the first scientist to promote this possibility was Leo Wiener. He pointed out that Columbus himself was aware that African mariners had preceded him. In his diary of his second voyage, Columbus tells of how the natives of Hispaniola actually had given him gold-tipped metal spearheads that they said were brought by black-skinned people who had come in large boats from the south and southeast. Upon returning to Spain, is that he actually took the spearheads and he sent them away, and they had them assayed, and these spearheads were covered in this metal this alloy that the inhabitants called guanin, which matched the metal used in spearheads made in Western Africa for thousands of years, as carried by medieval African warriors, including the Mali and the Moors.
It's a fascinating video if you want to see it for yourself. I mean, we'll post it in the description below.
Right.
However, these observations are frustratingly imprecise. Columbus does not identify these visitors as African, nor does he describe languages, ships, or origins with clarity. It's crucial to understand that these passages are in a document that has most likely been mistranslated. And you also have to consider colonial ambition in that Columbus had his own incentives to exaggerate or misunderstand what he heard, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
As evidence, these journals are ambiguous as historical signals. However, they are not meaningless. We cannot just, take them for granted. They are recording some form of historical access and some type of interaction that he did have.
Right, right.
But what matters here is not that these accounts conclusively prove African presence in the Americas before 1492. They do not. But what matters is that they complicate the idea that the Atlantic world was entirely sealed prior to the European conquest.
Yeah, that definitely leaves a lot open.
Right.
That he was not the first, Christopher Columbus, But this also leaves room for doubt that the first appearance of Africans in the Americas must only be through enslavement. So what I'm saying here is that means that to be clear, that is, let me clarify,
right,
that when you consider these journals, right, and you consider that he's talking about, that he met people who said they were talking about other dark people,
right,
that means that perhaps these Africans could have been here, right? Because the idea prior to Christopher Columbus was that he was the first,
right,
and that the world had not seen anything, the Americans had not seen anything or anyone until he showed up. Right. But this does make it possible that maybe there were Africans here before.
Right. I mean, this indigenous encounter kind of claims that we may have gotten here before captivity.
Exactly. Right.
The movement force is not forced displacement. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That distinction matters deeply.
Right. And modern skepticism often rests on a narrow evidentiary standard. If Africans were present, why is the proof not unmistakable? Right?
Right. But this question assumes that African presence would be documented with the same urgency and precision as European arrival.
And we know that would not happen.
Right. That assumption ignores how archives are produced. Mm-hmm. European chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were narrators of conquest.
Exactly.
Africans encountered outside the logic of enslavement did not fit the story Europe was preparing to tell about itself.
Right. And there's also a deeper epistemological issue at work. Indigenous knowledge, like West African oral traditions, did I say that word wrong?
You said it great.
Oh. Like West as I was saying, I'm sorry, guys. Like West African oral tradition, it was filtered through European ears and it was translated into European languages and recorded accordingly so to European priorities. So when indigenous people describe visitors from the South or from across the sea, those descriptions were interpreted through European geographical imagination, not through indigenous cosmology or trade or their own languages, right?
Right.
And so what survives in the archives, we already know has been compressed, flattened, and pretty much distorted. Right.
Primary source discussions of Columbus's journal, preserved and contextualized by institutions such as the Library of Congress, they make this very clear.
Right.
The journals themselves are fragments, That's what they say. Mm-hmm. Edited copies, translated versions, and secondhand reconstructions.
Right.
They do not give us certainty, because if Africans appear in the Americas only as enslaved labor, then Black presence is framed as accidental, coerced, and derivative of European action. But if there is even a possibility, however limited, that Africans arrived through migration, trade, or exploration, then Black presence predates captivity as a condition, not merely as a consequence.
Right. And this is why accounts continue to provoke discomfort, because they do not offer a new origin myth. They threaten an old one, right?
Right.
And the resistance to this discussion is not primarily about history, but about a narrative containment that, colonizers want to keep, right?
Right.
And allowing Africans into the pre-Columbian Atlantic as agents rather than cargo disrupts that whole moral architecture. And it introduces the possibility that Black people were not waiting to be discovered, captured, or defined.
Right.
But we were already encountering the world on our own terms. Right. And that possibility, even when unresolved, forces a reckoning with how history decides what kinds of accounts are believable and what kinds are quietly written out. Right?
One of the most persistent and emotionally charged arguments in this debate centers on the Olmec colossal heads of Mesoamerica. Supporters of pre-Columbian African contact point to the sculptures' broad noses, full lips, and rounded facial structures, features they interpret as African. And at first glance, that claim feels intuitive.
Yeah, they definitely look like what I would consider myself or my,
ancestors.
It's right to look
Absolutely.
like. Right.
Now, the faces do not resemble the narrow-featured European ideal that has dominated Western art history. Mm-hmm. And for many viewers conditioned by racialized visual shorthand, non-European is quickly read as African.
Right, exactly. So mainstream archaeologists, however, strongly disagree. Scholars studying the Olmec civilization do, however, agree that features that fall well within the phenotypic range of indigenous Mesoamerican populations. The heads are widely understood to be stylized portraits of local rulers that were carved with exaggerated traits meant to convey authority and power, not necessarily ethnic origin, right?
Right.
But crucially, no genetic, linguistic, or material evidence links the Olmecs to Africa, unfortunately.
This is where the discussion must slow down and become more precise. Now, we all know facial features alone are not reliable ethnic markers, especially when interpreted through modern racial categories that did not exist in the ancient world.
Exactly.
Broad noses and full lips are not exclusive to any single population. Indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, Melanesians, Polynesians, South Asians, and many other groups exhibit similar traits.
Mm-hmm. And I was going to say that, even Hawaiians, I'm not sure if they probably fall into Polynesian category, but I know this sounds totally probably crazy, but I literally thought Bruno Mars was a Black man until maybe like last year when I was having a conversation with somebody and I was like, and I did.
He could have been a Black man with a
Right.
process in his hair.
Right.
I've seen many Black men get their hair permed.
I'm super fly.
That's exactly. I mean, look. But you know what? Human variations do not follow the rigid boundaries that colonial racial science later imposed,
Right.
back then
Right.
to now. So, it's very easy for us to want that to be the case, but, it doesn't have to be.
And when you consider these sculptures, it's not the same as photography,
Right.
because the Olmec artists, they work within symbolic conventions, the colossal heads, the exaggerated expressions, as we stated before, those were used to communicate basically political status and divine authority.
Right.
And to treat those sculptures as literal biological records misunderstands how ancient art is pretty much functioned.
Right.
You know?
Right. Archaeology does not operate on resemblance alone. If African populations had been present in Olmec society in meaningful numbers, we would expect corroborating evidence such as African genetic markers and ancient remains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or we would see evidence of African tools, metallurgy, or ship technology.
Mm-hmm.
So far, no African writing systems or iconography have been discovered,
Mm-hmm.
right? None of this exists in the archaeological records.
Wow. So institutions like the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian directly addresses these claims. And when I say these claims, I mean that the Olmecs were African. And they explain that while the Olmec heads are visually striking and appearance-based interpretations, could make you believe that they were African, these interpretations essentially collapse under scientific scrutiny.
Right.
Because the consensus is clear. The sculptures reflect indigenous Mesoamerican people, and they're not of African descent.
No.
They're a different,
Right.
ethnic group.
But here's a deeper issue, and the reason this argument refuses to disappear. The appeal of the Olmec head theory is not purely about evidence. It's about recognition, right?
You mean like self-recognition?
It's about the recognition of ourselves in the Americas. For communities long denied historical agency, seeing African features in the ancient Americas feels like reclaiming presence in a world that had systematically erased it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that emotional impulse is understandable, but it creates a dangerous trap.
Mm-hmm.
When identity claims outrun evidence, they become vulnerable to easy dismissal, reinforcing the very hierarchies they seek to challenge.
I also wanted to say something at this point. I think that it also reinforces something about the fact that, we as Black people, we pretty much inherently believe that we've been lied to. Because, we have been, right? If we're to be honest, we have been. And I think that, if we were to suddenly discover, you see these Olmec heads and you're like, oh my God, I always knew that, I always knew we weren't
It's
who
natural.
they said we were, right?
Right.
And so I think that is also another part of it, is that, it's the fact that we just inherently distrust.
We call history his story.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, so
hey,
that says it all.
That's true.
That
That's true, yeah.
there's a immediate skepticism in what has been told to us to program our minds, because our historical experience has been that all that we have learned is so that we can be easily controlled.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And but the sad part about this whole thing is that, ironically, when we rely on facial resemblance or how someone looks, we actually end up using the same racial logic that the colonizers used on us, which was that where our bodies were categorized, ranked, and assigned meaning based only on our appearance.
Right.
And hey, that framework has never worked well for oppressed people, right?
It hasn't, no. And the real historical question is not whether Africans secretly founded Mesoamerican civilizations, right? The evidence does not support that claim at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
The more productive and defendable question is why Western history has trained us to equate civilization, innovation, and monumentality with whiteness. while treating any non-European achievement as anomalous unless explained away by outside influence, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Olmecs do not need Africa to validate their sophistication.
And Africa certainly does not need the Olmecs to prove their capacity for complexity, exploration, or imagination, or brilliance, you know?
Absolutely not. Mm-mm.
And understanding this distinction, you know, actually strengthens the argument rather than weakens it, because it allows us to separate legitimate critiques of Afrocentric or Eurocentric history, that is, from claims that collapse under scrutiny.
Right.
And to insist on something more radical than just myth making, you know,
Yeah.
a historical method that respects evidence, confronts the power structures that decides what paths are allowed to matter.
Right. Genetic evidence is often introduced as a decisive test in debates about pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
DNA, after all, carries a certain level of finality, right?
They say that it's indisputable.
That's
supposedly.
what they say.
Right.
And at first glance, modern genetic studies do show something intriguing. Very intriguing. Hey, you know what it is?
What's that?
Small amounts of African ancestry do appear in certain indigenous populations across the Americas. So, all of those Native Americans that are talking all of that jazz about not being African or whatever the case, y'all got a little African in y'all too. All right.
Some people do.
Some of y'all do.
Some people do.
All right.
Yeah. We don't want to start another discussion in the comments. Okay?
But how that ancestry arrived, now that's the question. And when is where this argument, that is where this argument is where it lives or dies, actually.
Okay.
How did that genetic code get inside of those indigenous people?
Well, across the field of population genetics, scholars overwhelmingly agree that these African genetic markers were a result of post 1492 contact, that is. And the timing of that, we have to pay close attention to that, because after European arrival, the Atlantic world was violently transformed. You know, we all know, you know, the transatlantic slave trade, you know, everything that happened to, you know, the indigenous peoples here.
Right.
You know, and then of course there was a lot of enslaved people did escape, and they formed these maroon communities.
Right.
And so we have Africans, indigenous people, and Europeans who lived in proximity. Right. But though we were living in conflict, also there was also alliances, and there were also a lot of romantic intercultural relationships.
Sounds like some hanky panky.
Right. That went on for centuries, and some of it was consensual.
Yeah.
Some of it was not consensual. And this produced, you know, people with mixed heritage, right?
Right.
And, you know, this more than provides a sufficient explanation to the limited African ancestry that we do find in the indigenous gene pools.
Right.
You know?
And from a genetic standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
The signal fits the history we already know.
Yeah.
If Africans had arrived in the Americas in meaningful numbers before Columbus, through migration, trade, or settlement, we would expect to see distinct genetic patterns, such as older African haplogroups embedded deeply in indigenous populations. Clear divergence dates predating the European contact, and widespread distribution consistent with long-term integration.
Okay. Well, instead, most African ancestry that is detected in the United States is going to be, where do you think that's going to be?
Yeah, it's going
to be in the, you know, the colonial era, plantation eras, you know,
slavery,
where it's going to be, you know, where we had those plantation economies, maroon societies, and that's where most of this, you know, older African
genome is going to be.
Right, exactly. And so when you look at this, the timeline does align with the ships that arrived after 1492.
How about that? Well, institutions like the National Human Genome Research Institute emphasize that genetic data does not interpret itself.
That is true.
Throw a monkey in your wrench.
And what do you mean by it doesn't interpret itself exactly?
Well, DNA must be read alongside archaeology, history, and demography.
Okay. I can buy that. Yeah,
right.
That makes sense.
So, as they're looking at the DNA, they also have to look at what happened historically around that area, any type of archaeological findings, and the demographic populations that existed in that area, right? And modern genetic tools, which include admixture analysis, haplogroup tracing, and molecular clocks, are powerful. But they're not time machines, right?
Yeah.
They
true.
cannot independently reconstruct undocumented migrations without corroborating evidence.
And there is also another methodological limitation that often goes unacknowledged.
Yeah.
And that is that genetics is strongest at predicting recent ancestry. So, of course, logically, this means that signals will weaken over time,
Right.
especially when populations are small and nomadic or mobile, and they will become overwhelmed by demographically, such as like when we look at the indigenous communities who were, overwhelmed in that manner after colonization, right?
Right.
And so now we have hypothetical minor pre-Columbian African presence that could, in theory, be genetically invisible at this point.
Right. But history cannot be built on what might be undetectable. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence, but neither is it license to assert presence. You want me to say that again?
Yes, please.
Absence of evidence is not proof of absence, but neither is it license to assert presence.
Okay. And this tension reveals something deeper about how people are using DNA in this debate. For some, genetic testing has become like a proxy for legitimacy. If DNA confirms a story, it is treated as the truth. And if it doesn't, the story is dismissed. But this doesn't exactly line up either, because it only reinforces a modern hierarchy of knowledge where lived history and non-Western epistemologies are always subordinate to laboratory validation.
And at the same time, genetics also disrupts simplistic racial narratives. The very existence of African ancestry within indigenous populations, even when post-1492, undermines the idea of fixed, pure categories. The Americas were never biologically sealed, right?
That's right. They were shaped through entanglement, violence, survival, adaptation,
all of that.
Right. And DNA tells a story of contact, but not one that some of us want to tell.
Right.
You
So the genetic evidence does not support a theory of widespread pre-Columbian African settlement, but it does support something equally important: that Black presence in the Americas cannot be reduced to a single moment of arrival of a single condition of existence. Enslavement was not the beginning of African humanity in the Atlantic world.
Certainly not.
It was the violent reorganization of it, however.
Yeah.
In understanding what genetics can and cannot prove keeps us grounded in evidence without surrendering to the illusion that science alone gets to decide whose history is conceivable.
Right. And what can be said with confidence is that Africans, as we already stated, were not strangers to exploration or cultural exchange. And before enslavement, Africans traveled, traded, and influenced societies across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East long before the modern era, long before Christopher Columbus. And whether that presence extended meaningfully into Americas before 1492 remains pretty much unproven. But the question itself exposes how much history has been filtered through colonial frameworks.
Rather than asking whether Africans were definitively the original inhabitants of the Americas, a more productive question may be why mainstream history so often minimizes African agency before slavery. Expanding education about African civilizations, maritime knowledge, and global interaction helps dismantle the myth that African history begins in chains.
Right. And in closing, this topic invites curiosity, skepticism, and care. Exploring possibilities should not mean abandoning evidence, nor should academic caution erase the human desire to reclaim lost histories. The truth may be less dramatic than legend, but it's still powerful. Africans were global actors long before enslavement, and understanding that reality changes how we see both the past and ourselves.
We appreciate you all for sticking with us until the end, guys. Please help us continue to grow our channel and get our stories out. Please like, share, subscribe, all of that stuff. Hit the notification bell.
Yeah, because if you don't, you won't know when we drop our next video.
Please put a comment in the comments below.
We love good discourse.
Yeah, join the community, and stick with us into the end. Help us to grow. We definitely would appreciate it. And until next time, good friends, we will bid you all a good adieu.
Peace.
Peace.